All right, so we're starting chapter 2 of Dewey's Logic. Chapter 2 is about the existential matrix of inquiry. Biological, so the biological context of inquiry. You could maybe kind of rephrase that chapter title. So the maybe biological context or biological situation within which inquiry takes place, or upon which or out of which inquiry takes place, something like that. This term matrix is kind of interesting. Dewey doesn't really use it that much, but you see it in this chapter and in the following chapter at least talking about the biological and cultural contexts within which and from which and by means of which and into which inquiry takes place. All right, so let's take a look at this. So he begins, this chapter and the following one are occupied with development of the statement that logic is naturalistic. So this is also about the naturalistic basis of inquiry when we're talking about the biological and cultural aspects of it. And he goes on, the present chapter is concerned with the biological, natural foundations of inquiry. It is obvious, without argument, that when men inquire, they employ their eyes and ears, their hands and their brains. These organs, sensory, motor, or central, are biological. Central here refers to the brain or the central nervous system. So these organs, sensory, motor, or central, are biological, of course. Hence, although biological operations and structures are not sufficient conditions of inquiry, they are necessary conditions, right? You need biology to do any of the stuff that we humans do. So, of course, biology is necessary for inquiry, but of course, that's not the only thing that you're going to need. The fact that inquiry involves the use of biological factors is usually supposed to pose a special metaphysical or epistemological problem, that of the mind-body relation. So biology can give, when you think about biology in relation to something like logic or epistemology, it can give rise to this idea, this problem of a mind-body relation. When thus shunted off into a special domain, its import for logical theory is ignored. So the mind-body problem becomes its own area of inquiry, and its relation to logic, well, it becomes separated off from logical theory. When, however, biological functions are recognized to be indispensable constituents of inquiry, logic does not need to get enmeshed in the intricacies of different theories regarding the relations of mind and body. It suffices to accept the undeniable fact that they are necessary factors in inquiry, and then consider how they operate in its conduct. So we don't actually need to concern ourselves too much with the mind-body problem, but we know that the body, biology, is necessary for inquiry, and that needs to be taken into account. We need to have some idea about how that's related, why that might matter for inquiry. The fact that we are biological beings, how does that affect how we inquire and how inquiry develops, right? The purpose of the following discussion is to show that biological functions and structures prepare the way for deliberate inquiry and how they foreshadow its pattern. So, biology foreshadows the development of logic. Inquiry is in part a biological function. It grows out of behavior, which of course is also based on biology. Biology is necessary for behavior. Behavior keeps our biologies going, and inquiry is a part of that. And we'll see maybe analogs or precursors of inquiry among non-human animals, lower animals, and things like that. So let's look at this next paragraph. So about this is going to get into what you might call, and what he sometimes calls, the postulate of continuity. This is a major postulate or theory or hypothesis of pragmatism. You see this a lot in really among all of the early pragmatists. So Dewey says that the primary postulate of a naturalistic theory of logic is continuity of the lower, or less complex, and the higher, more complex, activities and forms. And in the context of biology or evolution, when Dewey talks about forms, and this is true about many kind of older writers, forms refers to life forms, kind of morphologies, types of organisms, species, and things like that. So forms of life. That can be confusing because we also talk about forms of, logical forms and stuff. But in the context of biology and higher and lower things, I think he's talking about life forms and living activities. So the idea of continuity is not self-explanatory. So it needs explanation. But its meaning excludes complete rupture on one side and mere repetition of identities on the other. So what continuity does not mean is a complete rupture between things, between activities, and it does not mean just a continuous identity, a continuous repetition of the same thing. So that would not count as continuity in Dewey's sense either. So it precludes reduction of the higher to the lower, just as it precludes complete breaks and gaps. So reduction of higher to the lower would be a kind of identity, right? All these higher surface level phenomena are really just manifestations of this lower thing, so nothing really changes. That would be maybe a kind of continuity, but that's not really what Dewey is talking about. I mean, that would be a non-interesting, non-evolutionary, non-developmental continuity, whereas Dewey is interested in evolution and development, and of course precludes complete breaks and gaps. That is maybe more obvious when you're talking about a word like continuity. Of course, if something is continuous, we think it doesn't have breaks or gaps. So the growth and development of any living organism from seed to maturity illustrates the meaning of continuity. So biological development. The method by which development takes place is something to be determined by a study of what actually occurs. It is not to be determined by prior conceptual constructions, even though such constructions may be helpful as hypotheses when they are used to direct observation and experimentation. So development is something that has to be known through experiments, through observation of what occurs. We can't maybe give it as a kind of ideal that real things have to try to attain. We have to develop the concept of he said the method of development. The method by which development takes place. So the thing by which development takes place is not something that you presuppose out of kind of logic or rationality or reason or intuition, but you have to discover it through observation, even though you need some concepts to begin with, right? You need some conceptual constructions to begin as hypotheses to begin your search as to how development takes place. But then those will change after you observe, inquire. We'll go on. Next paragraph. We cannot, for example, say in advance that development proceeds by minute increments or by abrupt mutations, that it proceeds from the part to the whole by means of compounding of elements, or that it proceeds by differentiation of gross wholes into definite related parts. These are two ways that you might think about development, and people have thought about development, that it happens by small increments, by small little changes, or by very abrupt changes. These are two ideas actually about the theory of evolution, two ideas about how evolution is likely to take place, is most likely to take place. Is it very slow and gradual, or or is it more common than we think to have these abrupt mutations? Punctuated equilibrium, I believe, is the term for that. But that was maybe a little bit before Dewey's time, but people had similar ideas before. Anyway, so part to whole, so maybe it goes from part to whole by bringing parts together, right? That's kind of a machine model where you're composing something or building up something out of parts. Or more of an organic metaphor would be differentiation of gross wholes into definite related parts. This kind of happens with humans and other animals, where you have a whole, like an egg, and then that gets differentiated into related parts, like arms and legs and heads and stuff, get differentiated out of that kind of homogeneous stuff. So anyway, those are two ideas about development. And he says none of these possibilities are excluded as hypotheses to be tested by the results of investigation. What is excluded by the postulate of continuity is the appearance upon the scene of a totally new outside force as a cause of changes that occur. So what is excluded is something coming from the outside. Well, there's kind of exceptions or nuances to this. But development, first you look at the process itself. Like if you're watching a life form develop from an egg to a mature animal, a bird, say, you don't start off by supposing that there is some external force causing that, some totally new outside force causing that to happen. But there's some nuance here, so he says, perhaps from mutations that are due to some form of radioactivity, a strikingly new form emerges. And indeed, this was late 30s. I was thinking, for some reason, I was thinking this was after the atomic bomb, but this must have been before that. But of course, these concerns would be big in the 1950s of radioactivity. I don't know how much regular people thought about that before the atomic bomb. And then we had superheroes and monsters being created by jolts of radioactivity. But anyway, it's an interesting example. It's interesting that he's bringing radioactivity up bringing this example into the discussion. So perhaps radioactivity could cause a strikingly new form to emerge, but, he says, radioactivity is not invented ad hoc and introduced from without in order to account for such transformation. So you don't just take that because you see a mutation. Well, you're looking for reasons why this mutation occurred. Well, it could be something in the, some just accumulation of something in the genes. Genes were not well known at this time either. Or, I don't know, maybe there was some jolt of radioactivity. So that's not your first explanation if there's no maybe direct evidence to suggest that. It is first known to exist in nature. So something like radioactivity would first have to be known to exist in nature, and and then, if this particular theory of the origin of mutations is confirmed, is found actually to occur in biological phenomena and to be operative among them in observable and describable fashion. Right? So first, you know something about radioactivity. You can study it, see how it's connected to various biological phenomena, and it becomes observable and describable, explainable, predictable, all of that. On the other hand, should the conclusion of scientific investigation be that development proceeds by minute increments, no amount of addition of such increments will constitute development, save when their cumulative effect generates something new and different. So this is the other side of development that we talked about. You have this abrupt mutation. Maybe it's caused by radioactivity. If that's something that is known about and you've seen at work before and you know what kinds of things it causes, what kinds of mutations it causes, it could cause abrupt mutations, kind of these breaks in the expected pattern of things. But then you also have this idea of development by minute increments, but no amount of such increments will be definable by us as development, except when actually something new happens. So again, it gets back to this idea where continuity is not going to mean just repetition of the same thing. You're actually getting something new out of what was there before. That's the kind of development we're talking about. Getting something new out of what was there before. And what there before could be radioactivity, or it could just be the natural process through, say, genetics or accumulation of, natural accumulation of mutations, or whatever the case is. So let's see. A couple more paragraphs for today. So going on, the application of the postulate of continuity to discussion of logical subject matter means, therefore, negatively, that in order to account for the distinctive and unique characters of logical subject matter, we shall not suddenly evoke a new power or faculty like reason or pure intuition. So again, these first several paragraphs are about this postulate of continuity, and the negative side of that is that logical subject matter, when we're explaining logical subject matter, discussing logical subject matter, we're not going to be able to rely on a priori powers or faculties like reason or pure intuition. These are sometimes used to explain human logic, right? Human rationality. But we can't take these for granted. We have to figure out exactly what do those mean if we're going to use them to say something about logic. And that's the negative side, right? You don't have these pre-existing powers that you can use to explain it. And the positive side of that, of the postulate of continuity, positively and concretely, it means that a reasonable account shall be given of the ways in which it is possible for the traits that differentiate deliberate inquiry to develop. See, I got lost somewhere in this sentence. Positively and concretely, let's start again. It means that a reasonable account shall be given of the ways in which it is possible for the traits that differentiate the deliberate inquiry to develop out of biological activities not marked by those traits. I feel like I missed a verb or something, but the idea here is that we need to account for how the traits that make inquiry what it is, what we know it as, how do these develop out of biological activities that don't necessarily have those traits? This is that idea of getting something new out of what was there, how something new comes out of what is not new, right? And you have to be able to explain logic in that way. Look for precursors or simpler versions, primitive versions of logic in biological activities. And this is an interesting and tricky idea, and we'll see how Dewey deals with it, but I do think it's something that I would like logic to do, and people who discuss logic, you would like to see that happen, because logic is a human behavior. I would say it's not, I don't know what, how to conceive of it as separate from human life or human behavior, and human behavior is grounded in biology. So logic is logically grounded in biology too, so how can we make sense of that? But going on, it is possible, of course, to deal with what was called proximate logical subject matter without raising this question. And if you don't remember proximate subject matter, that's dealing with the relations among propositions, so relations of identity and contradiction and contingency and all of that. If Q, if P then Q or whatever. So relation, that's just like that kind of day-to-day logical stuff. Proximate subject matter of logic. And just to do that kind of stuff, maybe you don't really need to have an answer to how logic develops out of biological processes or activities. But it is cause for surprise that writers who energetically reject the intervention of the supernatural or the non-natural in every other scientific field feel no hesitancy in invoking reason and a priori intuition in the domain of logical theory, right? So there's a kind of maybe naturalistic oriented or enlightenment influenced kind of logician who might reject supernatural in explaining this thing or that thing. But when it comes to something like logic, they invoke these words like reason and intuition and don't really explain them, where they come from. It seems like these are just almost spiritual powers that belong to humans. But is that really satisfying just to stop there? I just point out that reason, this is an interesting point that a lot of people have discussed, maybe not as many people have discussed as one would like, but the psychologist Knight Dunlap, forgetting how his last name goes, called these deifications, playing on the word reification here, kind of punning with the word reification, where you take a word, an abstract word, and you treat it as if it's like a thing with its own powers. Like, one famous example is the invisible hand of the marketplace, which becomes like this concrete power that's directing stuff, as some people take it. That's not really how Adam Smith intended it, but the idea is similar. A similar thing kind of happens with words like reason and intuition. These become these independent spiritual powers that people have, when those are actually the things that we need to explain in order to deal with the broader questions of logic, to go beyond those proximate questions to ultimate questions, or these bigger questions about the place of logic. It would seem to be more incumbent upon logicians than upon others to make their position in logic coherent with their beliefs in other matters. I mean, that's a good line. Come on. I mean, a good... yeah, why not? You would think logicians would live up to their name and make their position logically coherent with their other beliefs. But doesn't always happen. Last paragraph for the day. If one denies the supernatural, then where is the? Yeah, that's right. If one denies the supernatural, then one has the intellectual responsibility of indicating how the logical may be connected with the biological in a process of continuous development. So I think that's self-explanatory based on what I've already said. If we're going to be naturalistic, just as a way to go about living and thinking, if we're going to be naturalistic, then you need to show how things are connected with natural processes in a continuous manner without any kind of supernatural, unexplainable breaks in it. This point deserves emphasis, for if the following discussion fails to fulfill the task of pointing out satisfactorily the continuous path, then that failure becomes, for those who accept the naturalistic postulate, but a challenge to perform the task better. And so Dewey is basically saying, this is the task that I've taken up. I might not do it to a satisfactory degree. I might not be totally successful. But if not, that just means you have to try to do it better. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean it can't be done or shouldn't be done. It's something that needs to be done, and maybe I'll not quite live up to what I'm trying to do, but then if not, then it becomes your responsibility. If you want to try to do things from this naturalistic perspective, it then becomes your challenge. Maybe that's better than responsibility, but your challenge to then perform the task better. Okay, so that's enough for right now. Continuing on in the next video.